Thanks for joining us in this new edition of Dr. Brown Talks with Scholars. I have really been looking forward to this interview with a dear colleague and friend. He is one of the world's most respected Old Testament Semitic scholars, in particular, an expert in Sumerian. And we'll tell you what that is. We'll even talk about the origins of the alphabet and all kinds of interesting things about the Old Testament. So I'm speaking with Richard Averbeck. He is professor of Old Testament Semitic languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. We'll talk about some of the things he's written, some of the projects he's working on. But without further ado, Dick, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm looking forward to it. I have been looking forward to it.
Great. So just to give a little background, kind of the short story of things, were you raised in the faith, or did you have some type of conversion experience a little bit later in life? How did you become a believer?
Yeah, I was not raised in the faith. I was raised in a church, but not a Bible teaching church. And I grew up on a dairy farm. And so I went away to study agronomy at a university, soil and plant relationships. And it was there in my first semester that I heard the gospel. And at a evangelistic banquet. Now, I went to the banquet for the food, but I didn't even know what evangelism was. But I heard the gospel, and it took over my life.
Amazing, amazing. And at what point did you feel the calling or just the gifting to be involved in scholarship?
Well, I think it kind of started kind of automatically for me. I heard when I was a very young Christian, a month or two, I heard that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament was written in Greek. So I assumed Christians learned Greek and Hebrew. So I found a school that taught Greek and Hebrew, and I went there. And that's where I found my wife, and so on and so forth. And so it just became kind of a natural step for me. At first, I was going to be a pastor, then I was going to be a missionary. And then I just got caught up when I was in seminary in Hebrew and Old Testament studies, and that led from one step to the next. I went to Drop C College in Philadelphia for a PhD. After that, Jewish school, and did a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies, and focused a lot in, as I went forward in life, I kept going backwards in history because I always wanted to know the foundations of things. That's always been the way I think. And so that's kind of snowballed, you know what I mean? I just lost interest in everything else.
Yeah. Oh, trust me, I understand. Having gone on a similar journey in different ways in terms of the similar studies and going back and just wanting to learn more about putting the Hebrew Bible in its context. And boy, if I can read the languages related to it and the literature related to it, then I can put things back in their context, and it would make a lot of sense. You just kept going back further than I did. And,
yeah,
all the way back to the Sumerians. All right,
yeah.
So who in the world were the Sumerians? And when I refer to you as being one of the top scholars in the field, it's a difficult field, and it's not one that many people get into. So it's a lot of hard work and effort to really to master this field, to understand the literature. But when we read in the Bible, do we read it? Does it talk about the Sumerians, or are they related to anybody in the Bible? How could you give us some bearings here?
Well, it's by the time Abraham came along, say around 2000 BC, the Sumerians had already been doing writing and so on clay tablets for about a millennium. And so there was all sorts of writing of wedges and so on clay tablets and so on and so forth that whole period of time. So the Sumerians are like the earliest people that we know, at least in Mesopotamia, that did any writing, or at least when we come to know what these markings were, at first they're all pictographic and logographic and so on. They're not really something you can pronounce until we get to a certain point. And when we start getting pronunciation indicators, we find out it's Sumerian. And we learn about that because the later Semites who lived in the same area actually learned their writing system from the Sumerians. And that's where you get Acadian from, and so on. And so all of these Semitic languages have a certain effect from the background of Sumerian being the source of the writing system in cuneiform and wedges in clay.
Right. So the Sumerians were not Semitic speaking people themselves.
No, they were not. We don't even know what family they belong to. It's completely lost in antiquity to us. And there's been all sorts of proposals and so on, but nothing's carried the day.
Got it. All right. So when we talk about pictographs, logographs, then cuneiform and syllabaries, alphabets, let's take a moment here to fill people in. So if you're communicating in pictographs, so you're basically drawing a picture of something. You want to refer to a man, there's a picture of a man. A picture of a dog is a dog, or the picture of the sun, maybe that's the sun, or maybe it's some deity represents the sun or something. You can't just have 20 or 30 pictographs. You need, what, thousands?
Yeah, there were lots of 2,000 signs or something like that in the origin of it, because it was so pictographic and you had to have something for everything and all of that. But it even goes back before that, before there was even inscribed clay tablets, there were these little tokens that they had that they used to keep track of how many sheep were in a pen or whatever. And the system, part of the system, not all of it, but part of the system seems to have originated from even these tokens that were used and impressed sometimes on clay, but just sometimes you got the tokens, put them in some kind of container, and that would tell you that's your accounting system.
Yeah, so things we take for granted, with writing and math and all these things developed over time. So what many people are used to, you mentioned the cuneiform wedge-shaped, it's almost like a chicken with its feet walking around on these clay tablets. Maybe you've seen a picture of Hammurabi's law code, so this giant tablet, these things on it. That's called cuneiform, which is wedge-shaped. So that comes from the pictures, right? The pictures then turn into these wedge-shaped things. Could you give me an example of like what one of these pictures were and how it could represent several different words?
Well, even you could think about it this way. If you have, say, a picture of a deer, you know what I mean, on a wall of a cave, or, on some kind of inscription or whatever, in English, we would pronounce that deer, but the word would be lulim in Sumerian, okay? So the problem is that when you see that picture, you can't determine how to say it, but you know what it means. You know what it is.
Yep.
Now, what can happen then is you can get not just a pictograph, but then you start getting like syllables. A sign can indicate not just a picture, but a syllable. So if you're going to say lu lim, for example, for deer, one syllable would be lu, another one would be lim. And then that's a syllabic writing of the same word that stands for the picture of a deer, so on. So whereas in English, we would, if we were doing it syllabically, we'd read it D, ear, okay, deer. And so we could see the same sign and pronounce it differently because we're using different language.
And then as things develop, so by the time this is developed as the writing system called Acadian, so that's used by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So people are familiar with those names from the Bible. And this language became the dominant language in the ancient Near East for many centuries. So you end up with about 600 different signs, which then occurred depending on what period of time in tens of thousands of variations. When I was in grad school, it was like 44,000 variations, but you write it in a standardized way. But then let's say that I'm looking at something in Sumerian that would be dinger for deity, but in Acadian, it could be that. So it could be standing for the word comes after this is a deity, or it could be ilu or il or lu. So it's a kind of complex system, the Acadian system. Do you still read that? Do you still read an Acadian regularly?
Yeah, in fact, all the dictionaries for Sumerian, the ancient dictionaries for Sumerian are in Acadian.
Got it.
You got to go back through Acadian to Sumerian and so on. And we have all multitudes of these lexical tablets, we call them, that just are there. And that's how we get back into it by this step back into it from the Acadians, who the beginning of the system was in Sumerian, but then the Acadians picked it up. But it's a very interesting transition that kept on happening.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I never got to Sumerian. At one point, I thought, yeah, let me try to add this in. That I thought, are you crazy? I remember talking to a friend of mine that was very strong in Semitics, and he's like, why in the world do you want to tackle this? And who's going to teach you? It's like, oh, I'm just going to try to learn it. It's like, don't bother right now, because I was already neck deep in other things. But you've been able to pursue it, which is so fascinating. So I want to come back to the ancient world in a little while, and then some specific Old Testament questions. But you, like me, did your PhD work with scholars who didn't believe what we believe.
Right.
Mainly Jewish scholars, but I had some others as well.
Mm-hmm.
So brilliant, learned people, knew things in scripture inside out, had vast things memorized, knew the ancient languages, didn't believe what we believed, and would believe in what we would call higher criticism. Mm-hmm. So different ways of reading the Bible, or Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and there were multiple Isaiahs, and just various things like that. You had been to seminary first. For me, I was always with secular scholars all through my college and grad school. But going from seminary to that environment, did you go through any challenges, any struggles in your own faith, or deep questions that they raised for you?
Well, there were challenges that were aimed at me and others, but they never really affected me. I was just too convinced. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I did take them seriously in terms of, okay, let's see what's really going on here. You know, that kind of thing. And I do that up till today. I actually have been writing quite a lot in the past several years in this area of higher criticism, mm-hmm. As someone who is pushing back for paradigm change against it, because there's just, I mean, it's a free-for-all in higher critical circles right now. There is no consensus, and I think you can't get to a consensus because your system kind of destroys whatever consensus shows up. And mm-hmm. So I think it's just a badly founded system, and the result is I'm working at, okay, I can push back on that system and why I think it doesn't work. But where I'm going is, okay, then how did it get composed? Okay, not just how didn't it get composed according to the historical critical method. I consider myself to be a historical critical scholar too, but in a different way. One who's tried to do historical critical work to show how it actually did get written, okay, through the period of the Old Testament times.
Yeah, and that's such important work that you're doing, because the issues remain. I remember there were things, the rabbis challenged me on messianic prophecy and other things, and those were serious challenges. And I interact to this day. Most recent interaction with a learned rabbi was a few minutes ago. So I continue to interact. The challenges from higher criticism, the so-called documentary hypothesis and other things, I never found those convincing, similar to you, mm-hmm. but obviously others have. And the fact is, when it's taught a certain way, and when our views are just discarded as obscurantist and dogmatic and fundamentalist, it does mess with people's faith.
Yeah.
So it does need to be addressed. By the way, there was the old joke, I don't know if it circulated in your Jewish circles, that the Orthodox had no problem with the so-called higher criticism, because it said, okay, you've got these multiple authors of different parts of the Pentateuch, and the J document, the E document, the D document, the P document. And then they said, but the one who put it all together is the R person, the editor, the redactor. And they said, yeah, R, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. We're good with that. He's the one that put it all together. But it was an ancient Near Eastern scholar, actually an Egyptologist, Kenneth Kitchen, who wrote some really effective books against documentary hypothesis and other things, saying this is just not the way things came together or were written in the ancient Near East. And from his perspective as an Egyptologist, really tackled a lot of it. But do you feel, because you're a respected Semitic scholar, and when it comes to philology, reading ancient texts, obviously there's debate, but you're still just reading words. You're not giving your opinion, how you feel about it or so on, or even how it came together. So there's a bit more objectivity often just when dealing with ancient texts than when we come to disputed biblical issues. Do you feel that you can make a case that upholds fundamental evangelical understanding, historic Christian understanding of the Old Testament without shutting your brain off in the process?
Oh, yes. And I really do take that seriously. I'm just convinced enough that I'm not afraid of any of the data that's out there from the Bible or the extra biblical world outside the Bible. There's just nothing to be afraid of here. I really trust the text. And so just walk right into it and see what happens. And I found that to be a very productive way to go at it. Okay. And not to let this or that kind of theory. I think the big problem is that in the historical critical world, when you're in it, whether you're a believer of it or not, okay, it gets really confusing because you always get this mix of actual data and theories about the data. And sometimes people treat their theories as if they're data. And the result is you get confused about what's what. You have to be able to sort that out. What's data, verifiable data, and what's theories about the data, whether they're conservative or liberal or whatever, doesn't matter. How do they fit the data? And it helps you to stay in the core material and never lose track of the primary textual material, biblical and otherwise. And you can therefore stay in the academic work and be productive.
So all too often we have appeals to authority. So-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, or we just have our own presuppositions. And we can go through a whole lifetime without ever just saying, well, let's just come to the text and see where it leads.
Yeah, right. I think that's what scholarship should be.
Yeah.
And I think evangelicals can do that scholarship as well as anybody else. It's the reality is that that's what we're supposed to be doing, and that's the way we can serve the church.
Now you focused a lot on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Leviticus in particular, with commentary and many, many important articles. And then it ties in with a lot of your larger ancient Near Eastern expertise. In your own journey, what would you say have been some of the most interesting discoveries for you that might not be well known in the mainstream larger Christian world, but were wonderful discoveries for you in your own journey?
Oh, there are a lot of them. I think the one that I've been paying a lot of attention to lately, I'm working on a book on the Old Testament law for the church and the believer.
Yep.
And the one that has stood out to me and what drove me to write this book is that as I was working on the Levitical material 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, I kept on finding out that the Levitical material kept on coming through into the New Testament, not just in terms of Jesus, but in terms of how to live the Christian life. Mm-hmm. Both are there. And I kept hearing people say that the quote unquote ceremonial ritual law doesn't apply to the believer, in terms of how they live their life. You have the moral, civil, ceremony, all that, and divided off, and the morals what applies, not the civil, ceremony, so on. And that's
and just to jump in, that's not it may be convenient for us to analyze certain laws, but that's not an internal Torah distinction or one that the Jewish community would recognize.
No, and the New Testament doesn't recognize it either.
Okay.
And so it's a way that kind of pushes part of the text out of our lives, when in fact the text keep pushing it way into our lives through its continued use in applying, say, the tabernacle to the church, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of examples of us being considered to be priests in the tabernacle, rocks in the tabernacle, all of this kind of thing that are meant to be meant for us to understand how the writers of the New Testament brought all of this into the New Testament life experientially. How it's supposed to affect us, and how we're supposed to think, how we're supposed to act, all of that. So that's one of the things that really has re-impressed itself on my mind as I work on this book, and it's a motivating factor for me.
You once pointed out, we were interacting about something, but that God explicitly in Leviticus talks about a purpose of the dietary laws. Explain that.
Oh, well, of course, that's a big one that comes through into the New Testament in a big way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've done is worked on these dietary laws, Leviticus 11 and related passages. And there's a number of things that are really interesting about it. First, if you actually work through it and you look at it, the general movement of the way things are described in that chapter is that the animals that you eat are not to be animals that eat other animals.
Mm-hmm.
We're not supposed to eat blood, right? So we're not supposed to eat animals that eat blood either. That becomes a foundational pillar in understanding clean and unclean animals. Okay, then that's in Leviticus 11. And then if you go to Leviticus 20, what you find out is that that's not that there's another part to it that's very important, and that is he's saying don't do Moloch worship, don't do this kind of sexual behavior, that any of these perversions in the land that you're going in to possess. And he says, this is why I've given you these laws of don't, be ye holy, do not eat these kind of animals, eat these kind of, and the clean and unclean animals get mentioned in the conclusion as to why God gave them, which is, if you don't eat the way these people eat, you can't have relationships with them. Mm-hmm. So the whole purpose, or one of the main purposes of the clean and unclean animal laws, was to keep the people of God separate from the nations around them and their corruptions. And that becomes then the big issue in the New Testament, because now we're supposed to have one church, right? Jew and Gentile together. Well, that becomes a big issue then in the New Testament. Well, how can we manage this? Because the animal laws, the food laws, were specifically meant to keep them separate from one another. And so that's what they have to work through in the New Testament. And it took a long time. It was a very difficult thing for the early church to manage because of the world they were coming from. So this is part of this whole system that helps us to understand what's going on in the New Testament if we understand what's going in the Old Testament first. I think a big part of the problem with the discussion about New Testament use of the Old Testament law, or what does it believe about the ongoing usefulness of the law, is that we tend to come from the New Testament work back rather than from the Old Testament work forward, which is the way the apostles were doing it. So this is all backwards, inside out, and upside down.
Mm. And if a Gentile Christian simply says, well, what am I supposed to do? So should I keep the dietary laws? Am I under that? What's your short, simple answer to that question?
My short, simple answer is that no one is required to keep those laws anymore, because the wall of partition, Ephesians 2, between Jew and Gentile has been broken down. And that was part of that breaking down of that wall of partition. Now, these laws were meant to be holiness and purity laws, right, in the Old Testament. Because these laws can't be followed in the church unless you have two churches, Jew and Gentile, separated out. Mm-hmm. Okay, they break down that wall. You don't do these, make these regulations reasons for separating as Christians. Okay, in other words, these are not the kind of things that you should be thinking about. And there's passages that say that explicitly. But one of the things that stands out is that these particular laws were about purity and holiness. God is still concerned about purity and holiness. It just gets applied, okay, in ways that correspond to the nature of the new covenant people in the churches spread out through the world. You can't separate out a Jew from Gentile in Christ, but you can have Jews who come to Christ, Messianic Jewish believers, who can still do Jewish things because they're Jewish. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's fine. No problem with that at all. But Gentiles don't have to become Jewish to become Christians. Okay, so there's like, you can do the Christian life, either Jewishly or Gentilely, but you can't use anything to separate out Jew from Gentile in the church.
Got it. You know, I remember one time reading through Leviticus, and it's going through the requirements for those in priestly ministry, and you can't have bodily defects, and it gets pretty detailed. And I remember reading it, and the effect of it was staggering, because I understood this is a physical lesson to teach me something spiritual about our calling as priests to God. So, you know, it's just like with children, you teach them certain principles, but those moral principles and responsibilities look one way for children and another way for teenagers, and another way for adults. So it's God bringing us on a journey to teach us certain things. Obviously, a lot of people struggle. They say, but it says in the Torah, this is forever. This is for all generations. And if anyone comes along and abolishes it, you know, Jesus says it in Matthew 5, then you shouldn't listen to them. So how do we sort this out? I'm sure you deal with that in the book you're working on. But again, you're able to give a simple answer based on in-depth study that then when you sort out the objections, you've got an answer to each. But when we hear about it's forever and Jesus doesn't come to abolish, but to fulfill, aren't you abolishing and saying that? How do you answer that?
Well, the way I answer that is go back to the Old Testament itself and see how the law actually changes within the law depending on the circumstances of the people. So, for example, while they were traveling through the wilderness around the tabernacle, if they were going to eat meat, they had to bring the animal to the tabernacle, make sure the blood went on the altar and the fat and so on, and then they could have that animal as a peace offering for a family meal or whatever, okay? However, that's not feasible when they get into the land. When they get into the land, they're spread out in the land. If you want to have meat for dinner tonight, you can't travel 20 miles and back, you know what I mean, to do that. So what we have in Deuteronomy 12, you have to bring anything that you're offering to the Lord still has to go on the altar to the Lord. Okay, you can't make other, things like this. You can't do that. But it develops what we sometimes call profane slaughter, which is that if you're in the land and you're far away, you can treat a sheep or a goat, a domestic animal, like it's wild game, which is that if you kill a deer or a gazelle or something like that, you can eat it as long as you drain out the blood as soon as you kill it, okay, and pour it out on the ground, cover it with dirt. Okay, that's fine. Then you can treat it as legitimate food. Well, that's true for domestic animals at this point. You don't have to sacrifice them in order to eat meat. Okay, you don't have to sacrifice them at the temple. So there's changes because logistically they move from being around the tabernacle as a camp to being in the land, spread out in the land. There's changes that have to happen because of the logistics of God's program, okay, the way it works. That starts in the Old Testament. When we come into the New Testament, now we have a kingdom that's not even a nation, right? We have the kingdom of heaven, and we have these churches spread out through the world amongst all the kingdoms and so on. And that it's a different situation. So because there's a different situation, there's certain things that have to apply in different ways. And that's how you work this out. And the text does a lot with this, actually. It tells us, okay, now what do we do with this in the New Testament? How does it apply? For example, going back to the clean and unclean laws. 1 Peter 1 has this passage, I think it's verse 16, talk, be holy for I am holy, which comes from Leviticus 11, clean and unclean animals, right, originally. And it goes on in that chapter, and what it does is it comes to a certain place where it says, I think it's verse 20, where the teaching is this. It says, in light of what Jesus has done for us with this blood and so on and so forth, in light of that, purify your what? Your hearts for a sincere love of the brethren. Okay? So it used purification terminology that came from physical purifications to apply it to change, purifying your heart. And why do you purify your heart? So you can love well. And that fits right with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and so on. And love your neighbors yourself. It fits. It actually is a way of taking these laws from the Old Testament and showing the effect that you're talking about, namely for how we live now, what it means to be a transformed believer, follower of Jesus.
And, you know, really traditional Judaism, which says every jot and tittle is forever, has all types of changes and adaptations because circumstances change. So it's the same question: how do we apply this principle or truth in our current situation? And to be faithful to the spirit of it, often the letter of it has to change.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that would be ultimately when Jesus talks about fulfilling the law. It's bringing everything to its fully intended purpose and meaning, which is still an ongoing process. So, just getting back to this for a moment, and there's so much imagery, so many quotations that you think go back to this. And again, First Peter, there's debate whether that was written to Jewish believers or to everyone. Certainly read by everyone, you know, as part of the New Testament as for everyone. But he doesn't apologize for quoting Leviticus. No. He doesn't say, by the way, I know this is outdated, but let me make a spiritual application. Just like Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 is repeating what Deuteronomy says over and over again: purge the evil from among you. But instead of killing people, we excommunicate. And he's writing to Corinthians on top of that. So a couple of years ago, when Andy Stanley had made the ill-advised comment that we need to unhitch from the Old Testament, and he and I interacted, and he came on my radio show to say poor choice of words, and we talked the things through. It still had some differences, but a lot in common. But there is this thing, just the latest manifestation of Marcionite thinking. The early church leader died in 160, wanting to discard the Old Testament. There's still something in the hearts and minds of many believers, which our discussion with Andy Stanley helped highlight, where the Old Testament is somehow on this lower level, or it's old versus new, whereas that's completely different than the way Jesus and the apostles thought.
Yeah, no, they saw what they were doing. In fact, I mean, he did so much. I mean, he was Jewish, right? And he lived the Jewish life well. When he healed a leper, go see the priest. You know what I mean? All of this. I mean, he followed through. He did all of this. And this was Christianity came out of Judaism and is a manifestation of Messianic Judaism, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens is that they didn't think about their problem. Their problem was not how to get rid of the law. You know what I mean? Okay. Their problem was, how do we go on living without it? You know what I mean? And because it was God's word. And what they were trying to do, and what the apostles and the Holy Spirit was guiding them to lead us in such a way that we could see how this continuity comes through in ways that correspond to the nature of the new covenant, with the law written on the heart. The law is not left behind in the new covenant. It's written on the heart in the new covenant. And that, I think, is what the New Testament is working out. Okay, it's working out. Okay, what does it look like then to take the law seriously in such a way that we can say, like Paul did at the end of his life in 2 Timothy 3, all scripture is inspired of God and is useful for instruction, rebuke, all of this, for equipping. He was talking there at that time, it seems, primarily about the Old Testament. And so this is an important foundation for the Christian faith, and we lose our anchor if we lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. So fundamentally, even if you just pull the references, every direct quote and allusion to the Old Testament from the New, or the history, the foundations, even the promised Messiah, there is no Messiah, there is no promise. I mean, that's all there, and it builds so rightly. And you focused, especially in your work in Leviticus, on the sacrificial system and some of the terminology used there. And I've used your writings there repeatedly, found them so in depth and so helpful. What would you say are some common Christian misconceptions about the sacrificial system?
Well, there's quite a bit, I think. And one of them, for example, the whole question of through the Leviticus 1:4 and following, you have this laying on of the hand. on the head of the animal that you're going to sacrifice, right? A lot of people have taken that to be you lay your sin on the animal, okay? But I don't think that's true except on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16, where it says you lay the sins on the head of the scapegoat. I think in the normal context in Leviticus 1 and 3, 4, so on, normal context, it's a way of dedicating the animal to the purposes of the offering. It's dedicating it to be holy to the Lord. One of the things that's clear, it's crystal clear to me in Leviticus 15:31, other passage, you don't want to contaminate the tabernacle with impurities, with sin, impurity, so on and so forth. You're supposed to keep that away from the tabernacle. The last thing you would do is when you dedicate an animal is put sin on it so it could go to the tabernacle. Okay? It's the opposite of how the system works. In fact, in the scapegoat, in Leviticus 16:21 and following, you put the high priest puts all the culpabilities of the people from the year onto the head of the scope, but that goat in no way is going to be sacrificed in the tabernacle. It's sent as far away as possible from the tabernacle to get rid of it. Okay? And that then becomes a more clear understanding of what Jesus is doing in bearing our sin. Okay? And so there's different parts of this system, but I think that's a basic misunderstanding that I think gets people all tangled up when they actually look at the passages.
All right, I'm going to probe on a couple more, but certainly Leviticus 16 is explicit, and the impartation through the laying on of hands. We know that principle of impartation through the laying on of hands is there, but I'm sure I have mentioned just by assumption, not having thought that through, that you would lay your hand on the animal in certain cases and it impart sin. Obviously, the worshiper would be conscious of a life for life principle.
Yeah.
As Rashi, the Jewish commentator, says, Leviticus 17, would be conscious of that there is some guilt or some type of substitution, but that's fascinating. The so-called scapegoat is sent away because you don't bring impurity in. What about the idea you commonly hear in the Old Testament, sins were covered, in the New Testament, they're removed? Is that a misconception on any level?
Yes, it is. Because in the Old Testament, it says they were forgiven. Okay, multiple times. It says in Leviticus 4 and elsewhere that when you do this sin offering, okay, and it's done properly, the priest makes atonement for you and you shall be forgiven. Okay, it's taken care of. Okay, that's the point. Now, that's on the level of the tabernacle system in the Old Testament, because they were in the physical presence of a physically manifested God in the cloud and the fire by night. So they needed to deal with their relationship with that tabernacle presence. Okay, where I think we get clarity on this is in Hebrews 9 and 10, where it actually goes through this in quite a bit of detail and talks about, okay, in the Old Testament system, blood was applied to the altar in the tabernacle, okay? And that was the blood of bulls and goats and so on and so forth. In the New Testament system, Jesus' sacrifice, the blood is applied to the heavenly tabernacle, the very presence of God. That's one of the ways of distinguishing between the old system and the new, okay? What was there in the sacrifice in the Old Testament does apply to Christ, but Christ applies his blood in the heavenly tabernacle. It says that in verses 12, 13, 14, okay? Later on, it does something else with this. It talks about how in the Old Testament system, on the Day of Atonement, you would get rid of all the corruption. The problem is you had to do it again the next year, okay? The difference is that Jesus never had to do it again. He did it once and for all because it cleansed the actual presence of God in heaven for us, and we have open access to that if we're in Christ. And so they never used the idea of the Old Testament, they covered it. In the New Testament, they took it away. Both take it away, but on the level of the particular tabernacle that's being talked about. Okay, the tabernacle on earth versus the tabernacle in heaven. This is why in Acts 21, Paul, when he came back to Jerusalem and met with James, and they were very zealous about the law in the Jewish church, okay, they say so, he's going to fulfill a vow, and he's going to go into the temple and do sacrifice in the temple. And he's going to pay for others to do sacrifice in the temple who are believers. He saw no contradiction there at all to what Christ had done for him. He did it because it was having to do with the physical temple. It didn't contradict the fact that he'd received the sacrifice of Christ on his behalf, okay, in his whole life eternally. So there's just not that, they didn't think this way. The Old Testament covered it, the New Testament took it away. They both took it away, but on the level, okay, of that, because a lot of people struggle with Acts 21, thinking that, what, did Paul make a mistake there or something like that? Mm-hmm. No, it just didn't work on the same level.
So if you said to Paul, well, these rites have there's some overlap with atonement in them, you don't need atonement anymore, how might he have answered that?
That's true. I don't need an atonement anymore, but the fact of the matter is, I do need to do this in the temple because I took a Nazirite vow, okay? I need to do this because that's what a Nazirite vow calls for. He found the Nazirite vow as a Jew useful to him, okay? So he followed through with the Nazirite vow as it was laid out. There was still a temple. So you should go do this. There's no temple anymore. So you can't do this. But the point is that this is the way they thought. They thought in terms of a lot of continuity, not so much cutting off. Okay, there's a lot of continuity, but it's transformed for the nature of the new covenant church and the new covenant itself, and the fact that now the Holy Spirit has come and done what he's done. There's all sorts of things going on that make this transition an important transition, but it is a major transition.
So let's say we push this forward to Ezekiel 40 through 48. And let's say that this is actually a prophecy of a temple that will be built in the millennial kingdom with blood sacrifices. So this was first brought to my attention by rabbis as a new believer, saying, well, why is that the case? Because our church taught that this was the future and was going to happen. So that's what I understood. And they said, well, if the sacrifice of Jesus is once and for all, then what are there going to be sacrifices in Ezekiel's temple? And to this day, we'll get on a regular basis people still asking about this. So some will say, well, that's why we don't believe in a physical, literal millennium, or others will say it's just metaphorical language. But from my understanding, that concept doesn't trouble you at all.
Not at all. It's the same thing as Paul going into the temple in Acts 21.
All right, so unpack that for us.
If you're Jewish, right, okay, and you're going to, even assuming that we have a literal millennial temple, okay, the atonement procedures for managing that temple on earth, okay, would be a natural thing to do, okay, just like it was natural to do that at the tabernacle on earth, and then later the temple, okay? This was a natural thing. But none of that ever did what Christ could do and what Christ has done. Cleanse the heavenly, very presence of God for us. This is on a totally different level, and Hebrews 9 and 10 belabors to make this clear.
All right, so if I just take that one step further then. So what Jesus did once and for all, unique, transcends for all time what happened in the temple. But temple life continued until the temple was destroyed roughly 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. During that time, the apostles still participated in normal temple life without a sense of contradiction. This was just part of the cleansing rituals and things like that. So if we go back to Leviticus 16, with the blood of the first of the two goats, it speaks of atonement being made. That word in English can throw us a little bit, because the first thing that had to be cleansed or purged was the physical building itself because that got contaminated. So is it that same kind of concept that we're dealing with various types of contamination having to do with the earthly structure and the earthly temple?
Yeah, that it's very much both the goat for the priests and the goat for the people. Okay, the ones that are slaughtered there. They're specifically about impurities. And those impurities could come in ways that were sinful and not sinful. You know, I mean, that's a whole nother subject, right? But the point is that they needed to be purged from the tabernacle so that it could be cleansed. It was like the fall cleaning day for the tabernacle. Get it ready for the next year. Okay, that had to be all taken care of so that you could start a new year, okay, and go from there. Then the scapegoat actually takes the culpabilities for sins and corruption, okay, and puts them on a goat and sends that far away from the whole community. So both the tabernacle and the community are completely purged for the coming year.
Got it. By the way, just a side note, do you have any opinion as to when in Jewish practice the ceremony changed from driving the second goat into the wilderness to actually killing it, driving it off a cliff sometime during the Second Temple? Do you have any opinion as to when that change happened?
No, I don't. No. It's an interesting little shift. I don't know when that happened, though.
Yeah, a friend was just asking me about it the other day, which brought it to mind afresh. All right, so before I go to two last questions for you, which of course are big questions. You've written about this on a more popular level, on a more academic level, and you're working on this book. I know it's been for years now. I can't wait for it to come out on Christians and the law. And it has saved me a lot of time. Just say, read this book, because we get these questions endlessly. And of course, as a Jewish believer challenged by the rabbis, I've had to think about them endlessly. And some of our conversations over the years have been very useful to me as well. But on a popular level, if someone wants to read, learn, understand some of these concepts, would it be Leviticus commentary? Where would they go for that? And then the best place for academics, if it's New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, the articles there, in terms of what you have already out, where would you point people?
Well, first, the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, back in the 1990s. I did, I think, for 4 volumes, I did like 200 or 300 pages in that.
Yeah, you did a lot.
Terminology. Since then, I've actually done, for example, the InterVarsity Dictionary of Old Testament, Pentateuch. I did the major article in there on sacrifices and offerings and on the tabernacle. And they're both 20, 30 pages long. That's in the early 2000s. And since then, I've been publishing articles. I got one coming out, I think, pretty soon now on the guilt offering and some of the major problems with that, trying to clarify what's going on with that. And then another one I'm working on right now on the sin offering. This is all part of this Leviticus commentary process.
Yeah.
And because, quite frankly, I must say that some of the basic issues of what's going on in Leviticus are still heavily debated by top scholars. There's a lot of confusion in this field. I think we're making progress, but I do think that there's been an awful lot of push back and forth to try to get there. And so I've kind of waited for a while and kind of looked at it all and listened and kind of prayed an awful lot about what's going on here. And I'm really feeling like the Lord has helped me. And so that's what I'm working on right now, is to kind of get that out there.
Wonderful. And of course, what's done in the academic world over a period of years then trickles its way down into more popular form through people that learn from it, and they begin to preach and teach from it or write. Others pick it up and write, or students of yours put things out. The Leviticus commentary, what is that part of series? When is that supposed to come out?
That's the Evangelical exegetical commentary by Logos. The one that's going to be both online, computer, electronic, and hard copy is available as well. And that's the series that I'm doing the commentary for. I think it's important. I did want to mention one thing that's come up a couple times. You talked about how Jews have massaged the material for what happens in the developments of Judaism. Christians have massaged it for how it comes. I think that's a really good ground for communication between the two. How have we massaged it differently or similarly or whatever? I think that's a good ground for good interaction between Jew and Gentile.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. And it's non-threatening in that regard.
Yeah.
It's with mutual respect for the foundational text and saying, because of that respect, here's how they've developed in our midst.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. Something that's now getting out more in the larger popular world, even among non-believers, is something that top scholars, Semitic scholars and others were writing about, and what they call the history of God. Or, for example, a top Ugaritic scholar, Mark Smith, writing on the early history of God, and others. And they would talk about, well, actually, and these are learned people, very much in touch with ancient sources. And they'd say, okay, if you look back, you'll see these various deities, be it El, be it Yahweh, or however their name was pronounced, that these are deities that were known to other peoples, and then little by little get incorporated and then merged into one deity in the Old Testament. And again, these are people with a lot of learning behind them, and now they're going to read the Hebrew Bible and say, and here's what supports it, etc. So we know that there are texts in the Old Testament that speak of other gods, but Yahweh being supreme to all of them and the only creator who is like you among the gods in Leviticus, Exodus 15, and passages like that. And then others, like in Isaiah 40 through 48, where even more God is saying there is no other deity. Any claim of being a deity is false. So it's just different usages of the concepts. But what do you make of this idea that Yahweh, Yahu was actually a known ancient Near Eastern deity who was then appropriated by the Israelites as their national deity?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with some of the data that's brought out there, okay, in the first place. I think that the best way to go at that is from the Exodus 3 passage, with where the name Yahweh, and Exodus 6, where this gets brought in, and it's brought in with a particular twist to it. And that is that the patriarchs knew these name El Shaddai, that kind of a thing. But now I'm making my name known, you know what I mean, in this kind of a special way, okay? And I think that the reason for this is because God is, whether there's background to Yah or Yahu or whatever elsewhere, I think that a lot of it is the purpose of the whole thing is just to help them to know that they have a God who is a personal covenantal God, okay? And that's important because he says that he's the covenantal God who's going to be present with them, okay? Bringing them out of Egypt, in the tabernacle, so on and so forth. And this presence issue, I think, is a big part of what the name Yahweh is about. Okay, it's not just I will be, but I will be with you. Okay, it's key to this. Moses makes a big deal of this after the golden calf incident, and the Lord says, "I'm not going to go with you; I'll kill you." When the Lord says that, and I said, "Well, if you're not going to go with us, then don't even take us up, to the land," because that was the key thing in Moses' view of what this name was about. Okay, God's commitment to be present. So that's what I think. Now, as far as the ancient Near Eastern material, we do have things. My colleague Lawson Younger has written an article on the Yahwistic theophoric names, the use of Yahweh in names. A lot of names that are thought to be Yahwistic theophoric actually aren't that at all. Okay, and you got to have it written in a certain way for it to be that. Okay, and so some of this has to be reworked. But I do think we have in Israel then the Israelites had an awful problem with idolatry, right? And they had an awful time with syncretism of Yahweh to the other gods. So we have these inscriptions with Yahweh and his Asherah, right? And things like this. Well, there's a difference between biblical theology and ancient Israelite religion, what they actually did with that theology or against it. Okay, and the Bible tells us about this. They had a horrible time with this. And so this is, I think, a big part of this whole discussion about how do we handle this names of God, but there's a specific reason that God gives this name Yahweh, and it's got to do with his presence.
I remember when the Cantilla Druid inscription was discovered, and that mentioned Yahweh and his female consort apparently was, written on the sides of the door, and there was upheaval, and how could it be? And there was a fellow that had been involved discovering an Israeli was giving a presentation at NYU, and I remember one of the fellows, I didn't know him personally, but had been a PhD student, and he just started reading from accounts in 2 Kings 23 and all the abominations in the temple in Josiah's day. I said, why should this surprise us? I mean,
really,
this is confirmation of what Scripture says about the idolatry in Israel. And then, the flip side is, okay, well, if all we relied on was the ancient Near Eastern literature and potential attestations to this God, Yah or Yahoo, what do we know about him compared to what do we know about Yahweh through the Scriptures? And you end up with this glorious mountain of revelatory truth versus a few snippets of maybe relevant information.
Yeah.
Last question for you. I've always thought that Ted's had the top Old Testament Semitic ancient Near Eastern scholars at an evangelical school in America. I had the privilege of delivering some lectures there many years ago. Had a great time with
we
everyone.
Appreciated that very much.
Yeah, that was a memorable experience. But from Willem van Gemeren, who oversaw so much of the problem and was such a polymath, and then you had K. Lawson Younger and his ancient expertise, and you Sumerian Acadian, and then you had James Hoffmeyer, Egyptologists, and things like this. You've got and others, Syriac scholars and others, top people. We often hear that archaeology, if you hear the popular Christian thing that archaeology has confirmed the Bible, and then you'll hear the critics and the skeptics saying, well, absolutely not. Archaeology does not confirm the wickedness of the Canaanites. Archaeology does not agree with the Exodus. Archaeology does not agree with the Exodus and the conquest and things like that. So this is the world in which you and your fellow scholars live. And again, the whole Sumerian Acadian world, even going back before that. Obviously, we could talk about this for hours, but just in short, as you interact with other specialists in the field, and by the way, there's a young man solidly in the faith now who just started classes at Gordon Conwell, or is about to start classes at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Jewish believer who came to the faith as a teenager through my radio broadcast, but he called in with questions about God and with some of the historical questions. I actually bought for him one of James Hoffmeyer's books that was relevant, and then sent him that and my book, The Real Kosher Jesus. Anyway, so he's been a solid believer and now starting seminary.
That's fantastic.
You have Professor Hoffmeyer's writings helped in that as well. But your overall assessment, if someone's new and they've been exposed to all this and they're questioning things, do you feel satisfied that overall there's harmony between the Bible and what we know archaeologically? Or do you feel, boy, there are a lot of big questions we just haven't answered yet? Overall, what's your sentiment and feeling as you've looked at these things?
My overall assessment is that there are things that we haven't resolved yet. Okay, there are still problems, but we've resolved a lot of them. And my experience has been that as I've faced them, you know what I mean, step by step, through my decades of study, I've been very satisfied with the trustworthy, the reliability of the Bible. Okay, not necessarily my reliability of my understanding of the Bible. Okay, I may have misunderstood things, and I see this, and I see correcting, and so on and so forth. But the Bible can stand the test of faith. And God has confirmed that to me through my study over many, many years. And I'm very thankful and I'm confident. So I'm not afraid of the questions.
Yeah.
I don't have to answer all the questions. Who could? And the fact is that archaeology is hit and miss. You're only going to come across certain stuff. You're not going to get answers to everything, and you shouldn't expect to. But what I've learned is that just keep on going, keep on pushing. If you don't have an answer right now to this, right? Well, okay, hold it in tension now, until you find an answer, or maybe you never will, but that's okay. Okay. Look at all the other answers you have. It's that kind of way I come at it. And it settles my heart as a scholar just to do scholarship and to do it honestly, intellectually honest way. Okay. But one of faith.
Yeah, and I'm so with you in that, in terms of my own journey and experience, where I felt early on, I know Jesus has radically changed my life, but I'm really being challenged.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, God, if you're really who I believe you are, then truth is not a threat to you. And I'm going to do my best to follow the truth wherever it leads. And I remember getting objection after objection, either from secular professors or maybe a hostile professor here and there, and then from various rabbis. And each time I'd say, okay, let's check this out. Let's see if it's valid, rather than just coming up with a cheap answer. And yeah, there are things that for years I would hold in tension, say, okay, I don't have an answer to that, but I know God and I know the truth of his word. And then it may be 10 years later, it's like, got it. And then it's really worth it. And the cheap answers don't really satisfy anybody.
Well, and the problem is they kind of disqualify the answer.
Yeah.
And the answerer. And this creates problems. We just don't want to create that kind of situation. We need to go as far as we can go and stop.
Yeah. And as I talked to you, Dick, there is a sense of you just being like a stabilizing force, just like a pillar of truth. And it's because you've got those foundations that go back so many centuries. You're not easily moved. You've been there, seen it, done it, kind of thing. The breadth and scope of history. So those roots are so deep that someone goes, well, I'm professor, I don't know. I just like, no problem. You just kind of smile, but it's based on scholarship. It's based on love for the truth. So look forward to your continuing work. By the way, how long do you think your Leviticus commentary is going to be?
It's going to be long. Just because right now I'm doing a lot of textual criticism, and that's getting long. So it's like this is just it's quite a process. But I've done a lot of the advanced work on trying to crack the problems.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm writing articles on, and I'll keep doing that. But I need to get and stay focused on writing a commentary. But I can't just write it without cracking the problems. You know what I mean? So that's the way. That's what.
Listen, I had Craig Keener on earlier talking about his 2 million word commentary on the book of Acts. And he's working on ICC commentary on Mark now. And he's concerned that it could be longer than the 3-volume Davies Allison commentary on Matthew, even though Mark is a lot shorter than Matthew. But hey, when you bring Craig on to do that, what do you expect when you bring on Dick Averbeck to do Leviticus? What do you expect?
Well, you're very kind. And I have similar respect for what you've done and continue to do.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's great to be on the same team. It's always a blessing to know you're there. And hopefully we'll get to connect face to face, maybe at ETS or one of these upcoming conferences. But I can't wait to share you and your knowledge with our wider viewing audience. So God bless it. And thanks so much for your time. Give my love to your whole family. Okay.
Thank you. And blessings to you and your family. The Lord be with you.
Thank you so much.